Edsel Day's blizzard of publicity was set by an ad published in newspapers all over the country in which the Edsel shared the spotlight with the Ford Company's president Ford and chairman Breech. In the ad, Ford looked like a dignified young father, Breech like a dignified gentleman holding a full house against a possible straight. The Edsel just looked like an Edsel. The accompanying text declared that the decision to produce the car had been based on what we knew, guessed, felt, believed, suspected about you, and added you are the reason behind the Edsel. The tone was calm and confident. There did not seem to be much room for doubt about the reality of that full house. Before sundown, it was estimated 2,850,000 people had seen the new car in dealers' showrooms. 3 days later, in North Philadelphia, an Edsel was stolen. It can reasonably be argued that the crime marked the high-water mark of public acceptance of the Edsel. Only a few months later, any but the least fastidious of car thieves might not have bothered. Decline and fall, the most striking physical characteristic of the Edsel was, of course, its radiator grille. This, in contrast to the wide and horizontal grilles of all 19 other American makes of the time, was slender and vertical. Of chromium-plated steel and shaped something like an egg, it sat in the middle of the car's front end and was embellished by the word Edsel in aluminum letters running down its length. It was intended to suggest the front end of practically any car of 20 or 30 years ago, and of most contemporary European cars, and thus to look at once seasoned and sophisticated. The trouble was that whereas the front ends of the antiques in the European cars were themselves high and narrow, consisting indeed of little more than the radiator grilles, the front end of the Edsel was broad and low, just like the front ends of all its American competitors. Consequently, there were wide areas on either side of the grille that had to be filled in with something, and filled in they were with twin panels of entirely conventional horizontal chrome grillwork. The effect was that of an Oldsmobile with the prow of a Pierce arrow implanted in its front end, or, more metaphorically, of the charwoman trying on the Duchess necklace. The attempt at sophistication was so transparent as to be endearing. But if the grille of the Edsel appealed through guilelessness, the rear end was another matter. Here, too, there was a marked departure from the conventional design of the day. Instead of the notorious tail fin, the car had what looked to its fanciers like wings and to others, less ethereal, minded, like eyebrows. The lines of the trunk lid and the rear fenders swooping upward and outward did somewhat resemble the wings of a gull in flight, but the resemblance was marred by two long, narrow taillights, set partly in the trunk lid and partly in the fenders, which followed those lines and created the startling illusion, especially at night, of a slant-eyed grin. From the front, the Edsel seemed, above all, anxious to please, even at the cost of being clownish. From the rear, it looked crafty, oriental, smug, one-up, maybe a little cynical and contemptuous, too. It was as if, somewhere between grille and rear fenders, a sinister personality change had taken place. In other respects, the exterior styling of the Edsel was not far out of the ordinary. Its sides were festooned with a bit less than the average amount of chrome, and distinguished by a gouged-out bullet-shaped groove extending forward from the rear fender for about half the length of the car. Midway along this groove, the word Edsel was displayed in Trome letters, and just below the rear window was a small, grill-like decoration, on which was spelled out, of all things, Sel. After all, hadn't Stylus Brown declared his intention to create a vehicle that would be readily recognizable? In its interior, the Edsel strove mightily to live up to the prediction of General Manager Crave that the car would be the epitome of the push. But the car would be the epitome of the push. The push-button era in medium-priced cars being what it was. Crab's had been a rash prophecy indeed, but the Edsel rose to it with a devilish assemblage of gadgets such as had seldom, if ever, been seen before. On or near the Edsel's dashboard were a push-button that popped the trunk lid open, a lever that popped the hood open, a lever that released the parking brake, a speedometer that glowed red when the driver exceeded his chosen maximum speed, a singly dial control for both heating and cooling, a tachometer in the best racing car style, buttons to operate or regulate the lights, the height of the radio antenna, the heater blower, the windshield wiper, and the cigarette lighter, and a row of 8 red lights to wink warnings that the engine was too hot, that it wasn't hot enough, that the engine was too hot, that it wasn't hot enough, that the generator was on the blink, that the parking brake was on, that a door was open, that the oil pressure was low, that the oil level was low, and that the gasoline level was low, the last of which the skeptical driver could confirm by consulting the gas gauge mounted a few inches away. Epitomizing this epitome, the automatic transmission control box, arrestingly situated on top of the steering post in the center of the wheel, sprouted a galaxy of 5 push buttons so light to the touch that, as Edsel could hardly be restrained from demonstrating, they could be depressed with a toothpick. Of the 4 lines of Edsels, both of the 2 larger and more expensive ones, the Corsair and the Citation, were 219 inches long or 2 inches longer than the biggest of the Oldsmobiles. Both were 80 inches wide, or about as wide as passenger cars ever get, and the height of both was only 57 inches, as low as any other medium-priced car. The Ranger and the Pacer, the smaller Edsels, were 6 inches shorter, an inch narrower, and an inch lower than the Corsair and the Citation. The Corsair and the Citation were equipped with 345 horsepower engines, making them more powerful than any other American car at the time of their debut. And the Ranger and the Pacer were good for 303 horsepower, near the top in their class. At the touch of a toothpick to the drive button, an idling Corsair or Citation sedan, more than 2 tons of car in either case, could, if properly skippered, take off with such abruptness that in 10 3/10 seconds it would be doing a mile a minute, and in 17.5 seconds it would be a quarter of a mile down the road. If anything or anybody happened to be in the way when the toothpick touched the push button, so much the worse. When the wraps were taken off the Edsel, it received what is known in the theatrical business as a mixed press. The automotive editors of the daily newspapers stuck mostly to straight descriptions of the car, with only here and there a phrase or 2 of appraisal, some of it ambiguous. The difference in style is spectacular, noted Joseph C. Ingram in the New York Times, and some of it openly favorable. A handsome and hard-punching newcomer, said Fred Olmsted in the Detroit Free Press. Magazine criticism was generally more exhaustive and occasionally more severe. Motor Trend, the largest monthly devoted to ordinary automobiles, as distinct from hot rods, devoted 8 pages of its October 1957 issue to an analysis and critique of the Edsel by Joe H. Wary, its Detroit editor. Wary liked the car's appearance, its interior comfort, and its gadgets, although he did not always make it clear just why. In paying his respects to the transmission buttons on the steering post, he wrote, "You need not take your eyes off the road for an instant." He conceded that there were untold opportunities for more unique approaches, but he summed up his opinion in a sentence that fairly peppered the Edsel with honorific adverbs. The Edsel performs fine, rides well, and handles good. Tom McCahill of Mechanics Illustrated generally admired the Bolt bag, as he affectionately called the Edsel, but he had some reservations, which, incidentally, throw some interesting light on an automobile critic's equivalent of an aisle seat. On ribbed concrete, he reported, "Every time I shot the throttle to the floor quickly, the wheels spun like a gone, wild-wearing blender. At high speeds, especially through rough corners, I found the suspension a little too horsebacky. I couldn't help but wonder what this salami would really do if it had enough road adhesion. By far the most downright, and very likely the most damaging, panning that the Edsel got during its first months appeared in the January 1958 issue of the Consumers Union Monthly Consumer Reports, SU. 800,000 subscribers probably included more potential Edsel buyers than have ever turned the pages of Motor Trend or Mechanics Illustrated. After having put a Corsair through a series of road tests, Consumer Reports declared, "The Edsel has no important basic advantages over other brands. The car is almost entirely conventional in construction. The amount of shake present in this Corsair body on rough roads, which wasn't long in making itself heard as squeaks and rattles, went well beyond any acceptable limit. The Corsair's handling qualities, sluggish, slow steering, sway, and lean on turns, and a general detached from the road feel are, to put it mildly, without distinction. As a matter of simple fact, combined with the car's tendency to shake like jelly, Edsel handling represents retrogression rather than progress. Stepping on the gas in traffic or in passing cars, or just to feel the pleasurable surge of power, will cause those big cylinders really to lap up fuel. The center of the steering wheel is not, in Q's opinion, a good push-button location. To look at the Edsel buttons pulls the driver's eyes clear down off the road. Praise Mr. Wary. The luxury-loaded Edsel, as one magazine cover described it, will certainly please anyone who confuses gadgetry with true luxury. 3 months later, in a roundup of all the 1958 model cars, Consumer Reports went at the Edsel again, calling it more uselessly overpowered, more gadget-bedecked, more hung with expensive accessories than any car in its price class, and giving the Corsair and the Citation the bottom position in its competitive ratings. Like Krav, Consumer Reports considered the Edsel an epitome. Unlike Krav, the magazine concluded that the car seemed to epitomize the many excesses with which Detroit manufacturers were repulsing more and more potential car buyers. And yet, in a way, the Edsel wasn't so bad. It embodied much of the spirit of its time, or at least of the time when it was designed early in 1955. It was clumsy, powerful, dowdy, gauche, well-meaning A.D. Kooning woman. Few people, apart from employees of Foote, Cohen's Belding, who were paid to do so, have adequately hymned its ability, at its best, to coax and jolly the harried owner into a sense of well-being. Furthermore, the designers of several rival makes, including Chevrolet, Buick, and Ford, Edsel's own stablemate, later flattered Brown's styling by imitating at least one feature of the car's much reviled lines: the rear-end wing theme. The Edsel was obviously jinxed, but to say that it was jinxed by its design alone would be an oversimplification, as it would be to say that it was jinxed by an excess of motivational research. The fact is that in the short, unhappy life of the Edsel, a number of other factors contributed to its commercial downfall. One of these was the scarcely believable circumstance that many of the very first Edsels, those obviously destined for the most glaring public limelight, were dramatically imperfect. By its preliminary program of promotion and advertising, the Ford company had built up an overwhelming head of public interest in the Edsel, causing its arrival to be anticipated and the car itself to be gawked at with more eagerness than had ever greeted any automobile before it. After all that, it seemed, the car didn't quite work. Within a few weeks after the Edsel was introduced, its pratfalls were the talk of the land. Edsels were delivered with oil leaks, sticking hoods, trunks that wouldn't open, and push buttons that, far from yielding to a toothpick, couldn't be budged with a hammer. An obviously distraught man staggered into a bar up the Hudson River, demanding a double shot without delay and exclaiming that the dashboard of his new Edsel had just burst into flame. Automotive News reported that in general, the earliest Edsels suffered from poor paint, inferior sheet metal, and faulty accessories, and quoted the lament of a dealer about one of the first Edsel convertibles he received. The top was badly set. The top was badly set, doors cocky, the header bar trimmed at the wrong angle, and the front springs sagged. The Ford company had the particular bad luck to sell to Consumers Union, which buys its test cars in the open market, as a precaution against being favored with specially doctored samples. An Edsel in which the axle ratio was wrong, an expansion plug in the cooling system blew out, the power steering pump leaked, the rear axle gears were noisy, and the heater emitted blasts of hot air when it was turned off. A former executive of the Edsel division has estimated that only about half of the first Edsels really performed properly. A layman cannot help wondering how the Ford company, in all its power and glory, could have been guilty of such a max-sentence routine of build-up and anticlimax. The wan, hard-working Krav explains gamely that when a company brings out a new model of any make, even an old and tested one, the first cars often have bugs in them. A more startling theory, though only a theory, is that there may have been sabotage in some of the 4 plants that assembled the Edsel, all but one of which had previously been and currently also were assembling Fords or Mercury. In marketing the Edsel, the Ford company took a leaf out of the book of General Motors, which for years had successfully been permitting and even encouraging the makers and sellers of its Oldsmobiles, Buicks, Pontiacs, and the higher-priced models of its Chevrolet to fight for customers with no quarter given. Faced with the same sort of intramural competition, some members of the Ford and Lincoln Mercury divisions of the Ford company openly hoped from the start for the Edsel's downfall. Krav, realizing what might happen, had asked that the Edsel be assembled in plants of its own, but his superiors turned him down. However, Doyle, speaking with the authority of a veteran of the automobile business, as well as with that of Krav's second-in-command, poohs the notion that the Edsel was the victim of dirty work at the plants. Of course, the Ford and Lincoln, Mercury divisions didn't want to see another Ford company car in the field, He says, but as far as I know, anything they did at the executive and plant levels was in competitive good taste. On the other hand, at the distribution and dealer level, you got some rough infighting in terms of whispering and propaganda. If I'd been in one of the other divisions, I'd have done the same thing. No proud, defeated general of the old school ever spoke more nobly. It is a tribute of sorts to the men who gave the Edsel its big buildup, that although cars tending to rattle, balk, and fall apart into shiny heaps of junk kept coming off the assembly lines, things didn't go badly at first. Doyle says that on Edsel Day, more than 6,500 Edsels were either ordered by or actually delivered to customers. That was a good showing, but there were isolated signs of resistance. For instance, a New England dealer selling Edsels in one showroom and Buicks in another reported that 2 prospects walked into the Edsel showroom, took a look at the Edsel, and placed orders for Buicks on the spot. In the next few days, sales dropped sharply, but that was to be expected once the bloom was off. Automobile deliveries to dealers, one of the important indicators in the trade, are customarily measured in 10-day periods, and during the first 10 days of September, on only 6 of which the Edsel was on sale, it racked up 4,095. This was lower than Doyle's first-day figure because many of the initial purchases were of models and color combinations not in stock, which had to be factory assembled to order. The delivery total for the second 10-day period was off slightly, and that for the third was down to just under 3,600. For the first 10 days of October, 9 of which were business days, there were only 2,751 deliveries, an average of just over 300 cars a day. In order to sell the 200,000 cars per year that would make the Edsel operation profitable, the Ford company would have to move an average of between 600 and 700 each business day, a good many more than 300 a day. On the night of Sunday, October 13, Ford put on a mammoth television spectacular for Edsel, preempting the time ordinarily allotted to the Ed Sullivan Show. But though the program cost $400,000 and starred Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, it failed to cause any sharp spurt in sales. Now it was obvious that things were not going at all well. Among the former executives of the Edsel division, opinions differ as to the exact moment when the portents of doom became unmistakable. Crabb feels that the moment did not arrive until sometime late in October. Wallace, in his capacity as Edsel's pipe-smoking semi-brain truster, goes a step further by pinning the start of the disaster to a specific date. October 4th, the day the first Soviet Sputnik went into orbit, shattering the myth of American technical preeminence and precipitating a public revulsion against Detroit's fancier baubles. Public Relations Director Warnock maintains that his barometric sensitivity to the public temper enabled him to call the turn as early as mid-September. Contrariwise, Doyle says he maintained his optimism until mid-November, by which time he was about the only man in the division who had not concluded it would take a miracle to save the Edsel. In November, says Wallace sociologically, there was panic and its concomitant mob action. The mob action took the form of a concerted tendency to blame the design of the car for the whole debacle. Edsel men who had previously had nothing but lavish praise for the radiator grille and rear end now went around muttering that any fool could see they were ludicrous. The obvious sacrificial victim was Brown, whose stock had gone through the roof at the time of the regally accoladed debut of his design in August 1955. Now, without having done anything further, for either better or worse, the poor fellow became the company's scapegoat. Beginning in November, nobody talked to Roy, Wallace says. On November 27, as if things weren't bad enough, Charles Chrysler, who, as the only Edsel dealer in Manhattan provided its prize showcase, announced that he was turning in his franchise because of poor sales. And it was rumored that he added, "The Ford Motor Company has laid an egg." He thereupon signed up with American Motors to sell its Rambler, which, as the only domestic small car then on the market, was already the possessor of a zooming sales curve. Doyle grimly commented that the Edsel division was not concerned about Chrysler's defection. By December, the panic at Edsel had abated to the point where its sponsors could pull themselves together and begin casting about for ways to get sales moving again. Henry Ford, manifesting himself to Edsel dealers on closed-circuit television, urged them to remain calm, promised that the company would back them to the limit, and said flatly, "The Edsel is here to stay." 1.5 million letters went out over Crabb's signature to owners of medium-priced cars asking them to drop around at their local dealers and test, ride the Edsel, Everyone doing so, Crive promised, would be given an 8-inch plastic scale model of the car, whether he bought a full-size one or not. The Edsel division picked up the check for the scale models, a symptom of desperation. Indeed, for under normal circumstances, no automobile manufacturer would make even a move to outfumble its dealers for such a tape. Up to that time, the dealers had paid for everything, as is customary. The division also began offering its dealers what it called sales bonuses, which meant that the dealers could knock anything from $100 to $300 off the price of each car without reducing their profit margin. Crive told a reporter that sales up to then were about what he had expected them to be, although not what he had hoped they would be. In his zeal not to seem unpleasantly surprised, he appeared to be saying that he had expected the Edsel to fail. The Edsel's advertising campaign, which had started with studied dignity, began to sound a note of stridency. Everyone who has seen it knows, with us, that the Edsel is a success, a magazine had declared, and in a later ad this phrase was twice repeated, like an incantation. The Edsel is a success. It is a new idea. On the American road, the Edsel is a success. Soon, the even less high-toned but more dependable advertising themes of price and social status began to intrude. In such sentences as they'll know you've arrived when you drive up in an Edsel and the one that's really new is the lowest. Price, too. In the more rarefied sectors of Madison Avenue, a resort to rhyme slogans is usually regarded as an indication of artistic depravity induced by commercial necessity. From the frantic and costly measures the Edsel division took in December, it garnered one tiny crumb. For the first 10-day period of 1958, it was able to report sales were up 18.6% over those of the last 10 days of 1957. The catch, as the Wall Street Journal alertly noted, was that the latter period embraced one more selling day than the earlier one. So, for practical purposes, there had scarcely been a gain at all. In any case, that early January word of meretricious cheer turned out to be the Edsel division's last gesture. On January 14, 1958, the Ford Motor Company announced that it was consolidating the Edsel division with the Lincoln Mercury division to form a Mercury Edsel Lincoln division under the management of James J. Nance, who had been running Lincoln Mercury. It was the first time that one of the major automobile companies had lumped three divisions into one since General Motors' merger of Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac back in the Depression. And to the people of the expunged Edsel division, the meaning of the administrative move was all too. With that much competition in a division, the Edsel wasn't going anywhere, Doyle says. It became a stepchild. For the last year and 10 months of its existence, the Edsel was very much a stepchild, generally neglected, little advertised, and kept alive only to avoid publicizing a boner any more than necessary and in the forlorn hope that it might go somewhere after all. What advertising it did get strove quixotically to assure the automobile trade that everything was dandy. In mid-February, an ad in Automotive News had Nance saying, since the formation of the new ML division at Ford Motor Company, we have analyzed with keen interest the sales progress of Edsel. We think it is quite significant that during the 5 months since the Edsel was introduced, Edsel sales have been greater than the first 5 months' sales for any other new make of car ever introduced on the American road. Edsel's steady progress can be a source of satisfaction and a great incentive to all of us. Nance's comparison, however, was almost meaningless. No new make ever having been introduced anything like so grandiosely, and the note of confidence could not help ringing hollow. It is quite possible that Nance's attention was never called to an article by S.I. Ayakawa, the semanticist, that was published in the spring of 1958 in etc., a review of General Semantics, a quarterly magazine under the title, Why the Edsel Laid an Egg. Hayakawa, who was both the founder and the editor of etc., explained in an introductory note that he considered the subject within the purview of general semantics because automobiles, like words, are important symbols in American culture, and went on to argue that the Edsel's flop could be attributed to Ford Company executives who'd been listening too long to the motivation research people, and who, in their efforts to turn out a car that would satisfy customer sexual fantasies and the like, had failed to supply reasonable and practical transportation, thereby neglecting the reality principle. What the motivation researchers failed to tell their clients is that only the psychotic and the gravelly neurotic act out their irrationalities and their compensatory fantasies. Hayakawa admonished Detroit briskly and added, The trouble with selling symbolic gratification via such expensive items as the Edsel Hermaphrodite is the competition offered by much cheaper forms of symbolic gratification, such as Playboy, 50 cents a copy, astounding science fiction, 35 cents a copy, and television, free. Notwithstanding the competition from Playboy, or possibly because the symbol-motivated public included people who could afford both, the Edsel kept rolling, but just barely. The car moved, as salesmen say, though hardly at the touch of a toothpick. In fact, as a stepchild, it sold about as well as it had sold as a favorite son, suggesting that all the hoopla, whether about symbolic gratification or mere horsepower, had had little effect one way or the other. The new Edsels that were registered with the motor vehicle bureaus of the various states during 1958 numbered 34,481, considerably fewer than new cars of any competing make, and less than 1/5 of the 200,000 a year necessary if the Edsel was to show a profit, but still representing investment by motorists of over $100 million. The picture actually brightened in November 1958 with the advent of the Edsel's second-year models. Shorter by up to 8 inches, lighter by up to 500 pounds, and with engines less potent by as much as 158 horsepower, they had a price range running from $500 to $800 less than that of their predecessors. The vertical grille and the slant-eyed rear end were still there, but the modest power and proportions persuaded Consumer Reports to relent and say, the Ford Motor Company, after giving last year's initial Edsel model a black eye, has made a respectable and even likable automobile of it. Quite a number of motorists seem to agree. About 2,000 more Edsels were sold in the first half of 1959 than had been sold in the first half of 1958. And by the early summer of 1959, the car was moving at the rate of around 4,000 a month. Here, at last, was progress. Sales were at almost a quarter of the minimum profitable rate. Instead of a mere fifth, on July 1, 1959, there were 83,849 Edsels on the country's road. The largest number, 8,344, were in California, which is perennially beset with far and away the largest number of cars of practically all makes, and the smallest number were in Alaska, Vermont, and Hawaii, 122, 119, and 110 respectively. All in all, the Edsel seemed to have found a niche for itself as an amusingly eccentric curiosity. Although the Ford Company, with its stockholders' money still disappearing week after week into the Edsel, and with small cars now clearly the order of the day, could scarcely affect a sentimental approach to the subject, it nonetheless took an outside chance and in mid-October of 1959 brought out a third series of annual models. The 1960 Edsel appeared a little more than a month after the Falcon, Ford's first, and instantly successful, venture into the small car field, and was scarcely an Edsel at all. Gone were both the vertical grille and the horizontal rear end, and what remained looked like a cross between a Ford, Fairlane, and a Pontiac. Its initial sales were abysmal. By the middle of November, only one plant, in Louisville, Kentucky, was still turning out Edsels, and it was turning out only about 20 a day. On November 19, the Ford Foundation, which was planning to sell a block of its vast holdings of stock in the Ford Motor Company, issued the prospectus that is required by law under such circumstances, and stated therein, in a footnote to a section describing the company's products, that the Edsel had been introduced in September 1957 and discontinued in November 1959. The same day, this mumbled admission was confirmed and amplified by a Ford Company spokesman who did some mumbling of his own. If we knew the reason people aren't buying the Edsel, we'd probably have done something about it, he said. The final quantitative box score shows that from the beginning, right up to November 19, 110,810 Edsels were produced, and 110 Edsels or 409,466 were sold. The remaining 1,344, almost all of them 1960 models, were disposed of in short order with the help of drastic price cuts. All told, only 2846 of the 1960 Edsels were ever produced, making models of that year a potential collector's item. To be sure, it will be generations before 1960 Edsels are as scarce as the Type 41 Bugatti, of which no more than 11 specimens were made, back in the late 20s, to be sold only to Bona fide kings, and the 1960 Edsel's reasons for being a rarity are not exactly as acceptable, socially or commercially, as the Type 41 Bugattis. Still, a 1960 Edsel Owners Club may yet appear. The final fiscal box score on the Edsel fiasco will probably never be known, because the Ford Motor Company's public reports do not include breakdowns of gains and losses within the individual divisions. Financial buffs estimate, however, that the company lost something like $200 million on the Edsel after it appeared. Add to this the officially announced expenditure of $250 million before it appeared. Subtract about $100 million invested in plant and equipment that were salvageable for other uses, and the net loss is $350 million. If these estimates are right, every Edsel the company manufactured costed and lost money about $3,200, or about the price of another one. In other, harsher words, the company would have saved itself money if, back in 1955, it had decided not to produce the Edsel at all, but simply to give away 110,810 specimens of its comparably priced car, the Mercury. The end of the Edsel set off an orgy of hindsight in the press. Time declared the Edsel was a classic case of the wrong car for the wrong market, at the wrong time. It was also a prime example of the limitations of market research, with its depth interviews and motivational mumbo-jumbo. Business Week, which shortly before the Edsel made its bow, had described it with patent solemnity and apparent approval, now pronounced it a nightmare, and appended a few pointedly critical remarks about Wallace's research, which was rapidly achieving a scapegoat status equal to that of Brown's design. Jumping up and down on motivational research was, and is, splendid sport. But of course the implication that it dictated or even influenced the Edsel's design is entirely false, since the research being intended only to provide a theme for advertising and promotion was not undertaken until after Brown had completed his design. The Wall Street Journal's obituary of the Edsel made a point that was probably sounder and certainly more original. Large corporations are often accused of rigging markets, administering prices, and otherwise dictating to the consumer hypes observe it. And yesterday, Ford Motor Company announced its 2-year experiment with the medium-priced Edsel has come to an end, for want of buyers. All this is quite a ways from automakers being able to rig markets or force consumers to take what they want them to take. And the reason, simply, is that there is no accounting for tastes. When it comes to dictating, the consumer is the dictator without peer. The tone of the piece was friendly and sympathetic. The Ford Company, it seemed, had endeared itself to the Journal by playing the great American situation comedy role of Daddy the Bungler. As for the post-mortem explanations of the debacle that have been offered by former Edsel executives, they are notable for their reflective tone, something like that of a knocked-out prizefighter opening his eyes to find an announcer's microphone pushed into his face. In fact, Kraft, like many a flattened pugilist, blames his own bad timing. He contends that if he had been able to thwart the apparently immutable mechanics and economics of Detroit, and had somehow been able to bring out the Edsel in 1955, or even 1956, when the stock market and the medium-priced car market were riding high, the car would have done well and would still be doing well. That is to say, if he had seen the punch coming, he would have ducked. Kraft refuses to go along with a sizable group of laymen who tend to attribute the collapse to the company's decision to call the car the Edsel instead of giving it a brisker, more singable name, reducible to a nickname other than Eddie and not freighted with dynastic connotation. As far as he can see, Kraft still says the Edsel's name did not affect its fortunes one way or the other. Brown agrees with Kraft that bad timing was the chief mistake. I frankly feel that the styling of the automobile had very little, if anything, to do with its failure, he said later, and his frankness may pretty safely be left unchallenged. The Edsel program, like any other project planned for future markets, was based on the best information available at the time in which decisions were made. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Doyle, with the born salesman's intensely personal feeling about his customers, talks like a man betrayed by a friend. The American public, it was a buyer's strike, he says. People weren't in the mood for the Edsel. Why not is a mystery to me. What they'd been buying for several years encouraged the industry to build exactly this kind of car. We gave it to them, and they wouldn't take it. Well, they shouldn't have acted like that. You can't just wake up somebody one day and say, "That's enough. You've been running in the wrong direction. Anyway, why did they do it?" Golly, how the industry worked over the years. Getting rid of gear, shifting, providing interior comfort, providing plus performance for use in emergencies. And now the public wants these little beetles. I don't get it. Wallace's Sputnik theory provides an answer to Doyle's question about why people weren't in the mood. And furthermore, it is sufficiently cosmic to befit a semi-brain truster. It also leaves Wallace free to defend the validity of his motivational research studies as of the time when they were conducted. I don't think we yet know the depths of the psychological effect that first orbiting had on us all, he says. Somebody had beaten us to an important gain in technology, and immediately people started writing articles about how crummy Detroit products were, particularly the heavily ornamented and status, symbolic medium-priced cars. In 1958, when none of the small cars were out except the Rambler Chevy, almost ran away with the market because it had the simplest car. The American people had put themselves on a self-imposed austerity program. Not buying Edsels was their hair shirt. To any relics of the sink or swim 19th century days of American industry, it must seem strange that Wallace can afford to puff on his pipe and analyze the Holocaust so amiably. The obvious point of the Edsel story is the defeat of a giant motor company, but what is just as surprising is that the giant did not come apart or even get seriously hurt in the fall, and neither did the majority of the people who went down with him, owing largely to the success of 4 of its other cars: the Ford, the Thunderbird, and later on the Small Falcon, and Comet, and then the Mustang. The Ford Company, as an investment, survived gloriously. True, it had a bad time of it in 1958 when, partly because of the Edsel, net income per share of its stock fell from $5.40 to $2.12, dividends per share from $2.40 to $2, and the market price of its stock from a 1957 high of about $60 to a 1958 low of under $40. But all these losses were more than recouped in 1959, when net income per share was $8.24, dividends per share were $2.80, and the price of the stock reached a high of around $90. In 1960 and 1961, things went even better. So the 280,000 Ford stockholders listed on the books in 1957 had little to complain about unless they had sold at the height of the panic. On the other hand, 6,000 white-collar workers were squeezed out of their jobs as a result of the Mercury, Edsel-Lincoln consolidation, and the average number of Ford employees fell from 191,759 in 1957 to 152,076 the following year, climbing back to only 159,500 finite. And of course, dealers who gave up profitable franchises in other makes and then went broke trying to sell Edsels weren't likely to be very cheerful about the experience. Under the terms of the consolidation of the Lincoln, Mercury, and Edsel divisions, most of the agencies for the 3 makes were consolidated too. In the consolidation, some Edsel dealers were squeezed out, and it can't have been small comfort to those of them who went bankrupt to learn later that when the Ford Company finally discontinued making the car, it agreed to pay those of their former colleagues who had weathered the crisis 1/2 of the original cost of their Edsel signs and was granting them substantial rebates on all Edsels in stock at the time of discontinuance. Still, automobile dealers, some of whom work on credit margins as slim as those of Miami hotel operators, occasionally go broke with even the most popular cars. And among those who earn their living in the rough-and-tumble world of automobile sales rooms, where Detroit is not always spoken of with affection, many will concede that the Ford Company, once it had found itself stuck with a lemon, did as much as it reasonably could to bolster dealers who had cast their lot with Edsel. A spokesman for the National Automobile Dealers Association has since stated, so far as we know, the Edsel dealers were generally satisfied with the way they were treated. Cone A. Belding also ended up losing money on the Edsel account, since its advertising commissions did not entirely compensate for the extraordinary expense it had gone to of hiring 60 new people and opening up a posh office in Detroit. But its losses were hardly irreparable. The minute there were no more Edsels to advertise, it was hired to advertise Lincolns, and although that arrangement did not last very long, the firm has happily survived to sing the praises of such clients as General Foods, Lever Brothers, and Transworld Airways. A rather touching symbol of the loyalty that the agency's employees have for its former client is the fact that for several years after 1959, on every workday, its private parking lot in Chicago was still dotted with Edsels. These faithful drivers, incidentally, are not unique. If Edsel owners have not found the means to a dream fulfillment, and if some of them for a while had to put up with harrowing mechanical disorders, many of them more than a decade later cherish their cars as if they were Confederate bills, and on Used Car Row the Edsel is a high premium item with few cars being offered. By and large, the former Edsel executives did not just land on their feet. They landed in clover. Certainly no one can accuse the Ford company of giving vent to its chagrin in the old-fashioned way by vulgarly causing heads to roll. Crav was assigned to assist Robert S. McNamara, at that time a Ford divisional vice president, and later, of course, Secretary of Defense, for a couple of months, and then he moved to a staff job in company headquarters, stayed there for about a year, and left to become a vice president of the Raytheon Company of Waltham, Massachusetts, a leading electronics firm. In April 1960, he was made its president. In the middle 60s, he left to become a high-priced management consultant on the West Coast. Doyle, too, was offered a staff job with Ford, but after taking a trip abroad to think it over, he decided to retire. It was a question of my relationship to my dealers, he explains. I had assured them that the company was fully behind the Edsel for keeps, and I didn't feel that I was the fellow to tell them now that it wasn't. After his retirement, Doyle remained about as busy as ever, keeping an eye on various businesses in which he has set up various friends and relatives and conducting a consulting business of his own in Detroit. About a month before Edsel's consolidation with Mercury and Lincoln, Warnock, the publicity man, left the division to become director of news services for the International Telephone Telegraph Corps in New York, a position he left in June 1960 to become vice president of community counselors, the public relations arm of McCann Erickson. From there, he went back to Ford as Eastern Promotion Chief for Lincoln. Mercury, a case of a head that had not rolled but had instead been anointed. Brown, the embattled stylist, stayed on in Detroit for a while as chief stylist of Ford Commercial Vehicles and then went with the Ford Motor Company Limited of England, where, again as chief stylist, he was assigned to direct the design of consoles, Anglias, trucks, and tractors. He insisted that this post didn't represent the Ford version of Siberia. I have found it to be a most satisfying experience, and one of the best steps I have ever taken in my career, he stated firmly in a letter from England. We are building a styling office and a styling team second to none in Europe. Wallace, the semi-brain truster, was asked to continue semi-brain trusting for Ford, and since he still didn't like living in Detroit or near it, was permitted to move to New York and to spend only 2 days a week at headquarters. They didn't seem to care anymore where I operated from, he says modestly. At the end of 1958, he left Ford, and he has since finally achieved his heart's desire, to become a full-time scholar and teacher. He set about getting a doctorate in sociology at Columbia, writing his thesis on social change in Westport, Connecticut, which he investigated by busily quizzing its inhabitants. Meanwhile, he taught a course on the dynamics of social behavior at the New School for Social Research in Greenwich Village. I'm through with industry, he was heard to declare one day with evident satisfaction as he boarded a train for Westport, a bundle of questionnaires under his arm. Early in 1962, he became Dr. Wallace. The subsequent euphoria of these former Edsel men did not stem entirely from the fact of their economic survival. They appear to have been enriched spiritually. They are inclined to speak of their Edsel experience, except for those still with Ford, who are inclined to speak of it as little as possible, with the verve and garrulity of old comrades, in arms hashing over their most thrilling campaign. Doyle is perhaps the most passionate reminiscer in the group. It was more fun than I've ever had before or since, he told a caller in 1960. I suppose that's because I worked the hardest ever. We all did. It was a good crew. The people who came with Edsel knew they were taking a chance, and I like people who'll take chances. Yes, it was a wonderful experience, in spite of the unfortunate thing that happened. And we were on the right track, too. When I went to Europe just before retiring, I saw how it is there. Nothing but compact cars, yet they've still got traffic jams over there. They've still got parking problems. They've still got accidents. Just try getting in and out of those low toxic cabs without hitting your head, or try not to get clipped while you're walking around the Arc de Triomphe. This small car thing won't last forever. I can't see American drivers being satisfied for long with manual gear, shifting, and limited performance. The pendulum will swing back. Warnock, like many a public relations man before him, claims that his job gave him an ulcer. His second, But I got over it, he says. That great Edsel team. I'd just like to see what it could have done if it had had the right product at the right time. It could have made millions. That's what. The whole thing was 2 years out of my life that I'll never forget. It was history in the making. Doesn't it all tell you something about America in the 50s? High hopes and less than complete fulfillment of them? Krav, the boss of the great Team Monk, is entirely prepared to testify that there's more to his former subordinates' talk than just the romantic vaporings of old soldiers. It was a wonderful group to work with, he said not long ago. They really put their hearts and guts into the job. I'm interested in a crew that's strongly motivated, and that one was. When things went bad, the Edsel boys could have cried about how they'd given up wonderful opportunities to come with us. But if anybody did, I never heard about it. I'm not surprised that they've mostly come out all right. In industry, you take a bump now and then, but you bounce back as long as you don't get defeated inside. I like to get together with somebody once in a while, Gayla Warnock or one of the others, and go over the humorous incidents, the tragic incidents. Whether the nostalgia of the Edsel boys for the Edsel runs to the humorous or to the tragic, it is a thought-provoking phenomenon. Maybe it means merely that they missed the limelight they first basked in and later squirmed in. Or maybe it means that a time has come when, as in Elizabethan drama but seldom before in American business, failure can have a certain grandeur that success never knows. Chapter 3. The Federal Income Tax. Beyond a doubt, many prosperous and ostensibly intelligent Americans have in recent years done things that to a naive observer might appear outlandish, if not actually lunatic. Men of inherited wealth, some of them given to the denunciation of government in all its forms and manifestations, have shown themselves to be passionately interested in the financing of state and municipal governments, and have contributed huge sums to this end. Weddings between persons with very high incomes and persons with not so high incomes have tended to take place most often near the end of December and least often during January. Some exceptionally successful people, especially in the arts, have been abruptly and urgently instructed by their financial advisors to do no more gainful work under any circumstances for the rest of the current calendar year, and have followed this advice even though it sometimes came as early as May or June. Actors and other people with high incomes from personal services have again and again become the proprietors of sand and gravel businesses, bowling alleys, and telephone answering services, doubtless adding a certain elan to the conduct of those humdrum establishments. Motion. Picture people, as if fulfilling a clockwork schedule of renunciation and reconciliation, have repeatedly abjured their native soil in favor of foreign countries for periods of 18 months. Only to embrace it again in the 19th. Petroleum investors have peppered the earth of Texas with speculative oil wells, taking risks far beyond what would be dictated by normal business judgment. Businessmen traveling on planes, riding in taxis, or dining in restaurants have again and again been seen compulsively making entries in little notebooks that, if they were questioned, they would describe as diaries. However, far from being spiritual descendants of Samuel Pepys or Philip Hone, they were writing down only what everything cost. And owners and part owners of businesses have arranged to share their ownership with minor children, no matter how young. Indeed, in at least one case of partnership agreement has been delayed pending the birth of one partner. As hardly anyone needs to be told, all these odd actions are directly traceable to various provisions of the federal income tax law. Since they deal with birth, marriage, work, and styles and places of living, they give some idea of the scope of the law's social effects. But since they are confined to the affairs of the well-do, they give no idea of the breadth of its economic impact. Inasmuch as almost 63 million individual returns were filed in a typical recent year, 1964, it is not surprising that the income tax law is often spoken of as the law of the land that most directly affects the most individuals. And inasmuch as income tax collections account for almost 3/4 of our government's gross receipts, it is understandable that it is considered our most important single fiscal measure. Out of a gross from all sources of $112 billion for the fiscal year that ended June 30th, 1964, roughly $54.5 billion came from individual income taxes and $23.33 billion from corporation income tax. In the popular mind, it is the tax. The economics professors William J. Schultz and C. Lowell Harris declare in their book American Public Finance, and the writer David T. Bazelon has suggested that the economic effect of the tax has been so sweeping as to create two quite separate kinds of United States currency. Before, tax money, and after, tax money, and after tax money. At any rate, no corporation is ever formed, nor are any corporation's affairs conducted for as much as a single day without the lavishing of earnest consideration upon the income tax. And hardly anyone in any income group can get by without thinking of it occasionally, while some people, of course, have had their fortunes or their reputations, or both, ruined as a result of their failure to comply with it. As far afield as Venice, an American visitor a few years ago was jolted to find on a brass plate affixed to a coin box for contributions to the maintenance fund of the Basilica of San Marco the words "deductible for us. Income, tax purposes." A good deal of the attention given to the income tax is based on the proposition that the tax is neither logical nor equitable. Probably the broadest and most serious charge is that the law has close to its heart something very much like a lie. That is, it provides for taxing incomes at steeply progressive rates and then goes on to supply an array of escape hatches so convenient that hardly anyone, no matter how rich, need pay the top rates or anything like them. For 1960, taxpayers with reportable incomes of between $200,000 and $500,000 paid, on the average, about 44%, and even those few who reported incomes of over $1 million paid well under 50%, which happened to be just about the percentage that a single taxpayer was supposed to pay and often did pay if his income was $42,000. Another frequently heard charge is that the income tax is a serpent in the American Garden of Eden, offering such tempting opportunities for petty evasion that it induces a national fall from grace every April. Still, another school of critics contends that because of its labyrinthine quality, the basic statute, the Internal Revenue Code of 1954, runs to more than 1,000 pages, and the court rulings and Internal Revenue Service regulations that elaborate it come to 17,000. The income tax not only results in such idiocies as gravel-producing actors and unborn partners, but is in fact that anomaly, a law that a citizen may be unable to comply with by himself. This situation, the critics declare, leads to an undemocratic state of affairs, for only the rich can afford the expensive professional advice necessary to minimize their taxes legally. The income tax law in toto has virtually no defenders, even though most fair-minded students of the subject agree that its effect over the half-century that it has been in force has been to bring about a huge and healthy redistribution of wealth. When it comes to the income tax, we almost all want reform. As reformers, however, we are largely powerless, the chief reasons being the staggering complexity of the whole subject, which causes many people's minds to go blank at the very mention of it, and the specific, knowledgeable, and energetic advocacy by small groups of the particular provisions they benefit from. Like any tax law, ours had a kind of immunity to reform. The very riches that people accumulate through the use of tax avoidance devices can be, and constantly are, applied to fighting the elimination of those devices. Such influences, combined with the fierce demands made on the Treasury by defense spending and other rising costs of government, even leaving aside hot wars like the one in Vietnam, have brought about two tendencies so marked that they have assumed the shape of a natural political law. In the United States, it is comparatively easy to raise tax rates and to introduce tax avoidance devices, and it is comparatively hard to lower tax rates and to eliminate tax avoidance devices. Or so it seemed until 1964, when half of this natural law was spectacularly challenged by legislation originally proposed by President Kennedy and pushed forward by President Johnson that reduced the basic rates on individuals in two stages from a bottom of 20% to a bottom of 14%, and from a top of 91% to a top of 70%, and reduced the top tax on corporations from 52% to 48%. All in all, by far the largest tax cut in our history. Meanwhile, however, the other half of the natural law remains immaculate. To be sure, the proposed tax changes advanced by President Kennedy included a program of substantial reforms to eliminate tax avoidance devices, but so great was the outcry against the reforms that Kennedy himself soon abandoned most of them, and virtually none of them were enacted. Contrary, the new law actually extended or enlarged one or two of the devices. Let's face it, Clytus, we live in a tax era. Everything's tax era. Everything's taxes, one lawyer says to another in Louis Auchincloss's book of short stories called Powers of Attorney. And the second lawyer, a traditionalist, can enter only a token demurrer. Considering the omnipresence of the income tax in American life, however, it is odd how rarely one encounters references to it in American fiction. This omission probably reflects the subject's lack of literary elegance, but it may also reflect a national uneasiness about the income tax, a sense that we have willed into existence and cannot will out of existence, a presence not wholly good or wholly bad, but rather so immense, outrageous, and morally ambiguous that it cannot be encompassed by the imagination. How in the world, one may ask, did it all happen? An income tax can be truly effective only in an industrial country where there are many wage and salary earners, and the annals of income taxation up to the present century are comparatively short and simple. The universal taxes of ancient times, like the one that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem just before the birth of Jesus, were invariably head taxes, with one fixed sum to be paid by everybody, rather than income taxes. Before about 1800, only two important attempts were made to establish income taxes. One in Florence during the 15th century, and the other in France during the 18th. Generally speaking, both represented efforts by grasping rulers to mulct their subjects. According to the foremost historian of the income tax, the late Edwin R. A. Seligman, the Florentine effort withered away as a result of corrupt and inefficient administration. The 18th century French tax, in the words of the same authority, soon became honeycombed with abuses and degenerated into a completely unequal and thoroughly arbitrary imposition upon the less well-to-do classes. And as such, it undoubtedly played its part in whipping up the murderous fervor that went into the French Revolution. The rate of the ancient regime tax, which was enacted by Louis Exave in 1710, was 10%, a figure that was cut in half later, but not in time. The revolutionary regime eliminated the tax along with its perpetrators. In the face of this cautionary example, Britain enacted an income tax in 1798 to help finance her participation in the French Revolutionary Wars. And this was, in several respects, the first modern income tax. For one thing, it had graduated rates progressing from 0 on annual incomes under £60 to 10% on incomes of £200 or more, and for another, it was complicated, containing 124 sections, which took up 152 pages. Its unpopularity was general and instantaneous, and a spate of pamphlets denouncing it soon appeared. One pamphleteer, who purported to be looking back at ancient barbarities from the year 2000, spoke of the income tax collectors of old as merciless mercenaries and brutes, with all the rudeness that insolence and self-important ignorance could suggest. After yielding only about £6 million a year for 3 years, in large part because of widespread evasion, it was repealed in 1802 after the Treaty of Amiens. But the following year, when the British Treasury again found itself in straitened circumstances, Parliament enacted a new income tax law. This one was extraordinarily far ahead of its time, in that it included a provision for the withholding of income at the source. And, perhaps for that reason, it was hated even more than the earlier tax had been, even though its top rate was only half as high. At a protest meeting held in the City of London in July 1803, several speakers made what, for Britons, must surely have been the ultimate commitment of enmity toward the income tax. If such a measure were necessary to save the country, they said, then they would reluctantly have to choose to let the country go. Yet gradually, despite repeated setbacks and even extended periods of total oblivion, the British income tax began to flourish. This may have been, as much as anything else, a matter of simple habituation, for a common thread runs through the history of income taxes everywhere. Opposition is always at its most reckless and strident at the very outset. With every year that passes, the tax tends to become stronger and the voices of its enemies more muted. Britain's income tax was repealed the year after the victory at Waterloo, was revived in a half-hearted way in 1832, was sponsored with enthusiasm by Sir Robert Peel a decade later, and remained in effect thereafter. The basic rate during the second half of the 19th century varied between 5% and less than 1%, and it was only 2.5% with a modest tax on high incomes as late as 1913. The American idea of very high rates on high incomes eventually caught on in Britain, though, and by the middle 1960s, the top British bracket was over 90%. Elsewhere in the world, or at least in the economically developed world, country after country took the cue from Britain and instituted an income tax at one time or another during the 19th century. Post-revolutionary France soon enacted an income tax, but then repealed it and managed to get along without one for a number of years in the second half of the century. Eventually, though, the loss of revenue proved to be intolerable, and the tax returned to become a fixture of the French economy. An income tax was one of the first, if not one of the sweetest fruits of Italian unity. While several of the separate states that were to combine into the German nation had income taxes even before they were united. By 1911, income taxes also existed in Austria, Spain, Belgium, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, Holland, Greece, Luxembourg, Finland, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and India. As for the United States, the enormous size of whose income tax collections and the apparent docility of whose taxpayers are now the envy of governments everywhere, it was a laggard in the matter of instituting an income tax and for years was an inveterate backslider in the matter of keeping one on its statute books. It is true that in colonial times there were various revenue systems